From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Tonight I ordered a targeted military strike on the airfield in Syria from where the chemical attack was launched. It is in this vital national security interest of the United States to prevent and deter the spread and use of deadly chemical weapons.
Without congressional approval, the United States has attacked a Syrian airfield, marking the first military action by the U.S. against Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's forces since the Syrian war began 6 years ago. The move comes after the U.S. accused Assad's forces of using the airbase to carry out a chemical weapons attack that killed 86 people, including at least 30 children. Syria denies carrying out the attack. We'll host a roundtable discussion. Then to Capitol Hill, where senators invoke the nuclear option that will allow Supreme Court justices to be confirmed by a simple majority.
The nuclear option means the end of a long history of consensus on Supreme Court nominations. It weakens the standing of the Senate as a whole, as a check on the president's ability to shape the judiciary.
The vote ends a Democratic-led filibuster aimed at blocking Neil Gorsuch's confirmation, clearing the way for a Senate vote today on President Trump's pick for the Supreme Court. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. U.S. warships fired a barrage of missiles into Syria Thursday evening in the first direct U.S. assault on the Syrian government since the start of the civil war 6 years ago. The Pentagon said a pair of naval destroyers in the eastern Mediterranean fired 59 Tomahawk cruise missiles at a Syrian air base in Homs province. Syria's government said the strikes killed 6 people and condemned the U.S. attack as an act of aggression. In a short address from the Trump Mar-a-Lago Golf Resort in Palm Beach, Florida, President Donald Trump said the assault was retribution for a Syrian chemical weapons attack earlier this week that killed 86 civilians, including 30 children.
Tonight I ordered a targeted military strike on the airfield in Syria from where the chemical attack was launched. It is in this vital national security interest of the United States to prevent and deter the spread and use of deadly chemical weapons.
The attacks came without a declaration of war or any other form of authorization from Congress. California Democratic Congressmember Barbara Lee tweeted, quote, "This is an act of war. Congress needs to come back into session and hold a debate. Anything less is an abdication of our responsibility," unquote. And Republican Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky tweeted, "The president needs congressional authorization for military action as required by the Constitution," unquote. On Thursday evening, Trump did not respond to a reporter's questions about whether he'd seek congressional approval for the attack.
Mr. President, do you still believe you need military congressional authorization for military action in Syria?
Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much.
In 2013, Trump repeatedly tweeted comments blasting President Obama's push for an assault on Syria over a chemical weapons attack, writing, "The president must get congressional approval before attacking Syria. Big mistake if he does not," unquote. The Pentagon says it targeted its missiles to avoid Syrian chemical weapons storage sites as well as Russian troops and aircraft. Russia's foreign ministry quickly condemned the U.S. assault on Syria's government, saying it threatened international security. Russia said it would bolster air defenses across Syria and said it would suspend its deconfliction agreement, which prevents Russian and U.S. planes from coming into conflict over Syria. This is Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova.
Without bothering to understand what's happened, the United States resorted to a demonstration of force, to military confrontation with a country that is fighting international terrorism. It is not the first time the United States of America has demonstrated such a careless approach. It only worsens the problems already existing in the world and poses a threat to international security.
Democratic Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, who met with Syrian President Assad during a trip in January, warned the attack could escalate to a nuclear war, saying, quote, "It angers and saddens me that President Trump has taken the advice of war hawks and escalated our illegal regime change war to overthrow the Syrian government." We'll have more on President Trump's attack on Syria after headlines. On Capitol Hill, senators voted along party lines Thursday for a historic rule change that'll allow Supreme Court justices to be confirmed by a simple majority. The 52-48 vote ended a Democratic-led filibuster aimed at blocking Neil Gorsuch's confirmation, clearing the way for a Senate vote today on President Trump's pick for the Supreme Court. Republican Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said the move was necessary to break a stalemate.
Our Democratic colleagues appear poised to block this incredible nominee with the first successful partisan filibuster in American history. It would be a radical move, something completely unprecedented in the history of our Senate.
Majority Leader McConnell's comments came more than a year after he led his Senate colleagues on a campaign to refuse to even consider President Obama's pick for the Supreme Court, Merrick Garland. Democrats quickly condemned the move by their Republican colleagues to end the filibuster in Supreme Court confirmations, the so-called nuclear option. This is Senate Minority Leader Democrat Chuck Schumer of New York.
The nuclear option means the end of a long history of consensus on Supreme Court nominations. It weakens the standing of the Senate as a whole, as a check on the president's ability to shape the judiciary. In a post-nuclear world, if the Senate and the presidency are in the hands of the same party, there's no incentive to even speak to the Senate minority. That's a recipe for more conflict and bad blood between the parties, not less.
A final confirmation vote for Neil Gorsuch is set for today. He's expected to be confirmed as a Supreme Court justice, replacing Justice Antonin Scalia nearly 14 months after Scalia's death. House Intelligence Committee Chair Devin Nunes said Thursday he's recusing himself from the investigation into Russia's alleged ties to Trump associates and Russia's role in the 2016 U.S. election. Nunes' announcement came shortly before the House Ethics Committee said it was investigating whether Nunes illegally made classified information public. Republican House Speaker Paul Ryan said Thursday Nunes had done nothing wrong, but said he welcomed Nunes' decision to step aside.
It is clear that this process would be a distraction to the House Intelligence Committee's investigation into Russian interference in our election. So Chairman Nunes has offered to step aside as the lead Republican on this particular probe, and I fully support his decision.
Last week, the New York Times revealed White House officials met secretly with Nunes to show him classified U.S. intelligence reports detailing how Trump associates were incidentally swept up in surveillance carried out by American spy agencies as they conducted foreign surveillance. On the day after the secret meeting, Nunes, who served on Trump's transition team, held a news conference, then traveled back to the White House to supposedly brief the president about the documents the president's own staff had given him. Nunes' recusal came after President Trump told the New York Times Wednesday, without evidence, that former National Security Advisor Susan Rice committed a crime when she unmasked the names of Trump associates whose communications were swept up by U.S. intelligence agencies. At the time, Rice had the authority to internally reveal such names. Rice has denied leaking the names of any Trump associates, and there's no evidence she violated U.S. surveillance laws. In Florida, President Donald Trump welcomed Chinese President Xi Jinping to the Trump Mar-a-Lago Golf Resort Thursday for 2 days of talks centered on trade and North Korea's nuclear program. Over a steak dinner, Trump praised President Xi, saying in brief remarks the pair had developed a friendship. On the campaign trail, Trump bashed China's trade policy, once accusing China of raping the United States. In environmental news, the EPA plans to slash funding to programs aimed at protecting children and pregnant women from exposure to lead, a neurotoxin known to cause brain damage. The Washington Post reports the move would eliminate 70 EPA jobs while cutting nearly $17 million from the programs, which provide public education about the dangers of lead, as well as training to lead remediation workers. An estimated 38 million U.S. homes contain lead-based paint, with lead poisoning hitting communities of color the hardest. Meanwhile, the Bureau of Land Management has debuted a new cover photo for its website, a towering pile of coal. The 2004 photograph was supplied to the BLM by the Peabody Coal Company. It shows an 80-foot coal seam at an open-cut coal mine. Until recently, the website's main photograph showed two boys wearing backpacks gazing across a wild landscape of rolling hills. The website's new look came a week after Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke lifted an Obama-era ban on coal mining leases on federal land. In South Sudan, refugees fleeing civil war say government soldiers indiscriminately killed civilians, slitting the throats of adults, running down children with a vehicle, and shooting those who tried to flee. Hundreds of survivors recounted the violent scenes as they fled toward relative safety in Uganda.
I had two brothers. One of them was arrested by the soldiers and slaughtered for no reason. The other one was trying to flee but was shot dead. I don't even know what to do with their widows and children.
Reuters said at least 17 people were killed by government soldiers, while some 3,000 refugees crossed into Uganda this week. South Sudan has been racked by civil war since 2013, and the UN says parts of the country have entered a famine with 100,000 people at risk of starvation. Burmese leader Aung San Suu Kyi has denied that members of the Rohingya minority have experienced ethnic cleansing. The remarks came in an interview with BBC correspondent Fergal Keen.
Never worry that you will be remembered as the champion of human rights, the Nobel laureate who failed to stand up to ethnic cleansing in her own country?
No, because I don't think there's ethnic cleansing going on. I think ethnic cleansing is too strong an expression to use for what's happening.
It's what I think I saw there, I have to say.
Amnesty International has accused the Burmese military of murdering, raping and torturing Rohingya civilians in an ongoing campaign the human rights group says may amount to crimes against humanity. At least 20,000 Rohingyas have been forced to flee into Bangladesh to escape the violence. In Argentina, workers shut down the capital, Buenos Aires, Thursday in a 24-hour general strike protesting government job cuts and the policies of President Mauricio Macri. The strike came as Macri welcomed the World Economic Forum on Latin America to Buenos Aires. This is Argentina opposition lawmaker Alejandra Bodart.
President Macri will open the World Economic Forum, and economists from around the world will come. They are all neoliberals. There will also be business leaders who will discuss how to continue stealing the riches of our people, how to continue with plans to exclude one sector of society so as to enrich the same old ones.
And Navajo land defender Catherine Smith has died in Big Mountain, Arizona. While records say she was 98 years old, her family members say she was over 100. Smith spent decades defending Navajo land against intrusions by coal and uranium miners. She resisted resettlement after Congress passed the 1974 Navajo Hopi Land Resettlement Act, which forced an estimated 6,000 Navajo and 100 Hopi forced to relocate. In 1979, Smith famously fired a warning shot from her shotgun to scare off Bureau of Indian Affairs employees who arrived to build a fence, making a redefined Hopi boundary. This is Catherine Smith.
The U.S. government, they're trying to get rid of Navajo here took land away from us. They loaded our sheep, they loaded our cattle, they loaded our horse. They just took it away from us. I used this gun on U.S. trying to steal my land.
Catherine Smith died March 29th at the age of at least 98, possibly over 100. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We turn now to Syria, where the U.S. military has attacked a Syrian airfield, marking the first military action the U.S. has taken against Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's forces since the Syrian war began over 6 years ago. According to the Pentagon, 59 Tomahawk missiles were dropped on the Shayrat air base. Syrian state media reports 9 civilians, including 4 children, were killed after a U.S. missile hit a nearby village. The U.S. accused Assad's forces of using the Shayrat air base to carry out a recent chemical weapons attack that killed 86 people, including at least 30 children. Syria denied carrying out the chemical attack, saying the deaths occurred after Syrian airstrike hit a depot of rebel-controlled chemical weapons. The U.S. bombing comes just days after the Trump administration signaled support for allowing Assad to stay in power. But on Thursday, President Trump struck a very different tone.
On Tuesday, Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad launched a horrible chemical weapons attack on innocent civilians. Using a deadly nerve agent, Assad choked out the lives of helpless men, women, and children. It was a slow and brutal death for so many. Even beautiful babies were cruelly murdered in this very barbaric attack. No child of God should ever suffer such horror. Tonight I ordered a targeted military strike on the airfield in Syria from where the chemical attack was launched. It is in this vital national security interest of the United States to prevent and deter the spread and use of deadly chemical weapons. There can be no dispute that Syria used banned chemical weapons, violated its obligations under the Chemical Weapons Convention, and ignored the urging of the UN Security Council.
The U.S. notified Russia in advance of the U.S. strikes, condemning the U.S. attack, Russia did, calling it an act of aggression against a sovereign state in violation of international law. Following the attack, Russia suspended an agreement with the U.S. aimed at coordinating airspace over Syria. Russia is also reportedly offering to help Syria strengthen its air defenses. Meanwhile, there are reports that Syria is threatening to fire Scud missiles towards Israel if the U.S. carries out any more airstrikes on Syrian military targets. On Capitol Hill, several lawmakers have accused Trump of taking the military action without congressional authorization. Democratic Congresswoman Barbara Lee of California said, quote, "This is an act of war. Congress needs to come back into session and hold a debate. Anything less is an abdication of our responsibility," unquote. Meanwhile, Republican Congressman Thomas Massie sent out a tweet quoting a statement Trump made in 2013 saying, quote, "The president must get congressional approval before attacking Syria. Big mistake if he does not," unquote. We're joined today by a number of guests. We begin with Alia Malik, author of The Home That Was Our Country, a memoir of Syria. She's joining us here in New York. In Boston, we're joined by Lina Sergi Attar, a Syrian-American writer from Aleppo. She runs the Karam Foundation. In Washington, D.C., Phyllis Bennis is with us, fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. We welcome you all to Democracy Now! Alia, let's begin with you. Your response to this news of this first U.S. attack on the Syrian government, on the Syrian military, in response, President Trump said last night, to the gas attack on Tuesday.
Yes, that is what he said, but what his actual motivations were, I think, remain to be seen. My reaction is that there are a few things that are clear. One, that President Trump has distinguished himself from his predecessor in that he has shown he's a man of action. He has asserted, or the appearance, or he's created the appearance of sort of asserting a kind of independence from Russia, which, given the intrigue surrounding the Russian involvement with his election, is something that would have a benefit to him. And most importantly, what's missing is we don't really know what effect this will have on the extent to which Assad will continue to act with impunity in Syria. We know one of the airfields from which he's launched attacks has been destroyed, but we also know that President Assad can sort of twist just about anything to serve his own narrative. And the reality is, in moments like these, when the regime tends to lose face or has sort of appeared to be insulted or injured, the people who will pay the price for that will be Syrian civilians somewhere else. I mean, and most importantly, I guess what we did learn is that, for whatever reasons, Syrians dying by chemical weapons seems to raise the ire of people more than whether they're dying by bullets or mortars or barrel bombs, because no day is different in the last 6 years. Syrian civilians have been dying continuously because of both regime actors and also armed opposition actors. But most of the deaths have come from regime actions.
Let me turn to Lina Sergi Attar in Boston. We just spoke to you yesterday and now today. This very different world we've entered, although, as Alia says, Syrians are dying every day. It just matters. It seems to matter more when chemical weapons are used. Your response?
Well, I agree with Alia with what she was saying before. And I want to say that nobody wants more violence to happen in Syria. Nobody wants to welcome airstrikes in their country. But after 6 years of watching genocide, watching over 500,000 people die in Syria and the destruction of our homeland, today I am very happy that there is one less airfield for Bashar al-Assad to use to kill his own people out of the 26 airfields that have been used over the past 6 years to bomb the Syrian people, as Adia said, with chemical weapons, with barrel bombs, and with all sorts of weaponry. And we cannot forget the tens of thousands of people who are under torture in Assad's dungeons across Syria, and people are not talking about the people that have been imprisoned and being tortured for years now. And I was struck by the response of Syrians on social media in the past 12 hours or so. And one of the responses from an activist, Marcel Shahwaro, on Facebook is that she said that just having the possibility of only the possibility, not the actual knowledge that Syrians will no longer die from a chemical weapons attack, makes us feel happy today. So the possibility of less death for us is something that we have to take as a sign of positivity, and that's the sad state of the world we live in.
Phyllis Bennis, do you think this will lead to fewer deaths?
Unfortunately, I'm afraid I don't think it will. I think that the horror of this attack, and I think there is a particular issue around the use of chemical weapons because there's a particular international law prohibition against chemical weapons. So it does matter more. Unfortunately, that's not what we heard from President Trump. What we heard was that he was motivated by the claim that this was somehow in the U.S. interest, that this was going to protect Americans, which is simply not the case. He made no reference to what it might mean for Syrians, and he referred to it in terms of his own emotions. He was moved by seeing these children that had been killed so horrifically, as I think everybody who saw or heard anything about this attack. But that doesn't take into account, Amy, as we know, the problem of the war that has been waged in Syria and in the region, where the deaths of children have not motivated either U.S. officials, the deaths of children in Mosul, the deaths of children across Syria, the deaths of refugee children who are being denied entrance to the United States. The hypocrisy of it from the vantage point of the Trump administration is staggering. An administration that slams the door in the face overwhelmingly of children and women from Syria who are trying desperately to find refuge somewhere. This is something that might actually help some people. I don't think that an attack on one airfield, unfortunately, is going to change the military balance of forces. I think what we are seeing is a complete violation of international law by the United States in the context of other violations that have happened across the war battlefield in Syria, certainly more casualties caused by the regime, but violations of international law on all sides. The claim that somehow Trump's own emotions give him the right to now violate both domestic law, no consultation with Congress, and international law, no approval from the United Nations. This was an illegal act. This was an act of war. And to say that this is somehow going to make things better for Syrians, I'm afraid that after this, it's going to get much worse, not better.
Alia Malik, your response?
No, I mean, Phyllis raises some important points, but the reality is we don't know. We cannot really evaluate Trump's motivations because we still have no real answers on the collusion with Russia. I mean, if it is true that, you know, Trump is really friends with Putin, then okay, then this is all a kind of theater, and this is what a lot of Syrians are saying today, that it's just a sort of a performance to sort of make it look like there's independence between the two world leaders. We're at day one. Do I think that all of a sudden there's been some sort of, articulation articulation of a coherent policy from this administration as to what to do in Syria? No, absolutely not. I mean, we're just sort of speculating at this point until we can really know with some sort of transparency what the relationship is between this administration and its election and the Russians.
Lena, if you could respond to what Phyllis said, and also let's go to the comment of Tulsi Gabbard that I was just talking about, who just said she warned the attack could escalate to a nuclear war, saying it angers and saddens me that President Trump has taken the advice of war hawks and escalated our illegal regime change war to overthrow the Syrian government. She also said in her statement, a successful prosecution of Assad at the International Criminal Court will require collection of evidence from the scene of the incident, and I support the United Nations efforts in this regard. Without such evidence, a successful prosecution is impossible, she said. And she went on from there in her comments, and I wanted to get your comment on her full statement. She says, this escalation is short-sighted and will lead to more dead civilians, more refugees, the strengthening of al-Qaeda and other terrorists, and a direct confrontation between the United States and Russia, which could lead to nuclear war. Lena, your thoughts?
Well, for many years, since 2013, since the chemical weapons attack in Ghouta, which killed over 1,400 people, Syrians themselves have said, what comes after chemical weapons? Will Bashar al-Assad himself use nuclear war against us? And this is the question, how much further can we escalate this war against the Syrian people and Syrian civilians by the Assad regime and its allies? So this is the question that Syrians have been asking. They have been suffering for many years. They have been the ones living under the bombs and under the barrel bombs and under the threat of chemical weapons attacks. And since yesterday, although we have already heard that the Assad regime has struck several areas in Idlib since yesterday, for the most part, Syrian skies were quiet. And we are at that point of desperation where Syrians inside Syria, inside Khan Sheikhoun, and other areas across the country said for the first time they could hear birds in the skies. So escalation of war to a nuclear war, we don't know what will happen. But what we do know is that when a government bombs its own people with chemical weapons, there must be a response. And what we saw in the last administration with the red line remarks and hundreds of chemical weapons attacks that happened since then, including several attacks this year, which nobody responded to, that yes, the bombing of an airbase might make them think twice. And we go back to this idea of the possibility of less attacks because maybe he will think twice before bombing his own people once again. And we are very saddened by the loss of life every single day in Syria, by the destruction. No Syrian will be unkilled. We have paid a very, very high price for what the Syrian people came out on the streets in 2011 demanding dignity and freedom. We have come a long way from there, and this loss is something that we will have to mourn for a very, very long time, for decades perhaps. And Alia Malik writes about this beautifully in her new book. Syrians have paid a high price, and what we hope for is the end of violence and the transition to peace, justice, and freedom for Syria.
Lena Sergiato, I want to thank you for joining us. I know you have to leave, and I'm asking our other guests to remain with us. Syrian-American writer Alia Malik, also with us, author of The Home That Was Our Country, a memoir of Syria. Phyllis Bennis, fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies, and we'll be joined by others. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back in a minute.
يا حيف يا حيف يا حيف يا حيف يا حيف اخ ويا حيف زخ رصاص على الناس العزل يا حيف واطفال بعمر الورد تعتقلن كيف زخ رصاص على الناس العزل يا حيف واطفال بعمر الورد تعتقلن كيف وانت ابن بلادي تقتل بولادي وظهرك للعادي وعلي هاجم بالسيف يا حافن يا حاف ظهرك للعادي وعليها يم بالسيف يا حافن يا حاف وهذا اللي صاير يا حاف وبدار عاوية وما ويا حاف هذا اللي صاير يا حاف وبدار عاوية.
Oh Shame by Samir Shukhair. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman as we continue our roundtable discussion on Syria, the United States striking a Syrian military airbase for the first time in the 6-year Syrian civil war. Speaking Thursday, interestingly, at the Women in the World Summit in New York City, before the strike happened, before President Trump came out in Florida, former U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said the U.S. should take out Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's airfields after the chemical attack that killed scores of people on Tuesday.
I think we should have been more willing to confront Assad. I really believe that we should have and still should take out his airfields and prevent him from being able to use them to bomb innocent people and drop sarin gas on them.
For more, we are going to Lebanon, where we're joined by Ghassan al-Saadi, Syrian-Canadian writer, researcher based in Beirut. We are also continuing with Alia Malek, author of The Home That Was Our Country, a memoir of Syria. Phyllis Bennis is with us, a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. And we're joined by Medea Benjamin, who is co-founder of Code Pink. So let's go to Lebanon right now, to Ghassan al-Saadi. Your response to the first U.S. attack on the Syrian military base after the Tuesday chemical attack in Syria?
Well, my first response is that I personally don't think it's going to matter much in the long term. I think it's simply a symbolic attack. Let us not forget that the U.S. has told the Russians beforehand that they were going to do it. They hit a lone airbase. This won't really damage the capabilities of the Assad regime to do what it's doing. I also would like to highlight that regardless of the fact that it's the first so-called U.S. response on the Syrian regime, the U.S. has been bombing Syria since 2014, killing hundreds of civilians. So for me, I would have to disagree with my other guest, Alia, in saying that this is a positive thing. There can be nothing positive, nothing at all from the U.S. regime nor the Russian regime in their bombings and invasions of Syria.
You're referring to Lena.
Yeah, Lena and Alia mentioned that this is somehow positive. I mean, let's be honest. Both these superpowers, with other reactionary forces in the region, do not give a damn about Syrian self-determination nor justice for Syrians. Like they don't give a damn about other communities in the region from Bahrain to Yemen to Palestine. So I have no hope with the Putin regime or the Trump regime and whatever they do. They can say whatever they want, but their actions have proven that they really don't care. And they were just, it's basically barks between each other. And it's not really going to matter much for the people on the ground who are dying.
Alia, if you would respond.
Yeah, no, I didn't say it was a positive thing. I said it might mean that there's one less airfield from which these kinds of attacks can be launched. And I didn't come to this discussion about Syria today, and that's part of the problem. Is a lot of people are sort of weighing into it today. Since the very beginning, actually before 2011, we have been calling for accountability for the Assad regime and what it had sort of its persecution and prosecution of dissent and opposition for years. This goes back to before 2011. And similarly, I've never said that the only way to engage Syria or to hold Bashar al-Assad or other players accountable is with military intervention. I've never been pro-military intervention. The reality is this regime has backers, Iran and Russia. The United States at any point during the Obama administration could have confronted them not in a military sense in Syria, using Syria as a proxy, but in the kinds of negotiations that happen bilaterally all the time. Let's not forget the U.S. was negotiating a deal with Iran. It had a card to play. It had leverage that it could have used use on the Syrian regime's principal backer. And I just want to speak to the idea of what Tulsi Gabbard said about accountability. I don't disagree. Yes, there should be accountability. There's going to be no way to piece Syria back together if there isn't accountability for those who have perpetrated crimes, no matter what side they're on, or justice for the victims, no matter what side they're on. But a lot of people are kind of placing Syria as a character, as a bit character, into their larger sort of geopolitical narratives of what is happening in this world. Whether you're objecting to intervention by outside powers, Syria just becomes like the latest theater to have that discussion. Whether it's a discussion about sectarianism and whether Sunnis are being killed by Shia, it just becomes or Shia-related minorities. It becomes a way to look at Syria in that sense. But I've always advocated for looking at Syria for the sake of Syrians and creating a country that is stable and safe and free for all its people. So I just, Yazan, I appreciate Yazan's comments. He's correct. There's nobody who really cares about Syria, I think, other than its own people. But he shouldn't mischaracterize my position. And then one more thing I would just like to say. I have been struck in the last 6 years over the debate on Syria why there's a sort of a fixed amount of critical thinking or a fixed amount of anger or a fixed amount of sympathy and empathy. Once you take sort of one position, it's as if you cannot sympathize or empathize or be critical of another position. Just because one is critical of Russian intervention, does that mean that one cannot be critical of American intervention? And I think in a principled, coherent way of looking at these things, we won't fall into those traps, which a lot of people are falling into.
Yazan al-Saadi in Beirut.
I agree with her last point. I mean, there was and there continues to be a big problem in the discussions of Syria where geopolitics and ideological lines are defining over and beyond the rights and dignities of people. So this has been going on, and it's still going on till this day. The conversations about the U.S. bombing of an airfield in Syria has generated a sense of hysteria. Some people, that so-called anti-imperialist front, are saying this is the beginning of World War III, which is a ridiculous statement. And other people say this is the first time America has intervened in Syria. And this is not true. The Americans have been intervening in Syria for a long time in various ways, not really against the regime. And I agree with Alia there. It is not in their interest to promote and develop self-determination of Syrians. And it's a clear policy they have for the entire region. Let's look at the bigger picture here. And when I say the bigger picture, I'm talking about not the simple anti-imperialist or geopolitics discourse. I'm talking about what about self-determination for all the communities? Because what's happening in Syria is part of a process. This latest chapter that started in 2011 is part of a regional chapter that we saw erupting from Bahrain to Yemen and elsewhere. So really, any hope or any feeling by anyone that Russia or the U.S. or regional states like Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, or the regime itself care or want to promote Syrian or anyone else's self-determination and freedoms and security, it's ridiculous. It's a ridiculous assumption, you know?
I wanted to bring in Medea Benjamin, who has written extensively about war. She's author of Kingdom of the Unjust, Behind the U.S.-Saudi Connection, and there's certainly a Saudi connection here, also written about drones. Your thoughts last night when you heard that the U.S. had just struck a Syrian military base. As Yazan said, the U.S. has been part of coalition bombing in Syria for a long time, killed hundreds of people, but this is the first time attacking a Syrian military base.
Well, first, let's look at the history of the U.S. in the region and the legacy of the U.S. intervention, whether it's Afghanistan, Iraq, or Libya. It's all been terrible for the local people. I think we, on this conversation, all care about the Syrian people. Let's look at what we can do. And I think that means going to Congress, going out in the streets and saying we don't want U.S. Further intervention, but we do want something that will be positive for the Syrian people. That means immediately lifting of the Trump ban on Syrian refugees coming to the United States, funding of the $5 billion that the UN says is desperately needed to help the humanitarian crisis facing the Syrian refugees, and demand that the U.S. work with Russia to finally come to a ceasefire and work for a political solution, and that the United Nations get involved in this. I think this is an opening that we have to seize to say enough is enough. Enough people have died. More war is not the answer. Let's find a political solution.
I wanted to turn to what people are seeing on TV, what started to take over the networks last night when the Pentagon released video footage of the U.S. missiles firing. This is MSNBC anchor Brian Williams referring to that Pentagon video fired at Syria as beautiful, something like 3 times in 30 seconds.
Go into greater detail. We see these beautiful pictures at night from the decks of these 2 U.S. Navy vessels in the eastern Mediterranean. I am tempted to quote the great Leonard Cohen, "I'm guided by the beauty of our weapons." And they are beautiful pictures of fearsome armaments making what is for them a brief flight over to this airfield. What did they hit?
That is MSNBC's Brian Williams speaking last night, describing that footage, the Tomahawk cruise missiles flying into the air from the naval warships, reminding one of back in 2003, shock and awe in Iraq, certainly a very different scale. But Medea, your response?
It's absolutely disgusting, this glorification of weapons that are of much of mass destruction as the use of chemical weapons. The U.S. has been incinerating people for years with drone strikes. We killed over 200 people in Mosul just recently. The U.S. is arming the Saudis that have led to the catastrophic situation in Yemen, where 1 child is dying every single 10 minutes. We should not glorify the weapons, and we should not have selective sympathy for people who are dying, whether they're dying from our weapons or other nations' weapons.
These are some of the tweets from President Trump on Syria. Now, this is back in 2013, and the reason this period is significant, it was after the first chemical weapons attack when some 1,400 Syrians died. He tweeted, "What I am saying is stay out of Syria." Another tweet. "If Obama attacks Syria and innocent civilians are hurt and killed, he and the U.S. will look very bad." Again, to our very foolish leader, do not attack Syria. If you do, many very bad things will happen, and from that fight, the U.S. gets nothing. And he tweeted, "President Obama, do not attack Syria. There is no upside and tremendous downside. Save your powder for another and more important day." I was wondering if Yazin would respond to what President Trump said 4 years ago after that first chemical attack.
I mean, what is there to respond to a very revolting human being who is misogynistic, xenophobic, and a constant liar? I mean, there isn't much to respond to this man. I think he is clearly he's playing the game.
But last
he's
night,
playing the game.
Last night, talking about the cruel suffocating of the children.
I'm sorry, but when he's talking about the cruel suffocation of babies, right, this is a man that doesn't mind these babies drowning on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea with their family trying to escape the horrors of Syria. This man doesn't mind bombing places in Iraq where hundreds of people have died. This man doesn't mind supporting Saudi Arabia, the world's most embarrassing country, in its slaughter of Yemen. This man doesn't mind making a deal with Bashar al-Assad, a revolting tyrant, in order to fight ISIS. So I can't really take him seriously, nor can I take seriously as well another individual who is as revolting, Putin. Both of them are fascist individuals. Both of them don't give a damn about the people of this region or the communities of the world. So for me to respond to this man, why would I respond to a xenophobic, disgusting individual?
Phyllis Bennis of the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington. What has changed for Donald Trump? I mean, even a few days ago, on Friday, you had Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, and Nikki Haley, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, saying that they are shifting gear and that their priority is not to get Assad out.
That wasn't a shifting gear. The shifting gear was now suddenly, because of Trump's emotional reaction to the deaths of these particular children, what Yazin said is so crucially important, the hypocrisy, the selective outrage that this group of children somehow sparks the outrage that didn't exist when children were slaughtered under U.S. bombs in Mosul, when children were killed trying to make the crossing with their parents to a United States that would not accept them, that was slamming a door in their face and drowning on the beach as a result. You know, this is not about a strategy. This is about a lashing out. It may be tied to concerns about all the political ways that the Trump administration is losing support. That's certainly part of it. But I think we also have to recognize that historically, the role of the United States in the region has included a long-standing relationship with the regime of Bashar al-Assad and his father, whether it was recruiting the father to bring his Air Force to help the United States bomb Iraq in 1991, where Syrian planes were part of that coalition. In 2002, when Bashar al-Assad agreed that the United States would be able to outsource torture and interrogation to Syria because they were experts at that, and sent U.S.-held detainees to be tortured by the Syrian regime in Syria. So, you know, this history of relationship, collaboration, coalition with the Syrian regime, and then at particular moments for their own purposes, and it's true, it has nothing to do with concerns about the people of Syria. There are now at least 11 separate wars being waged in Syria, and only one of them has something to do with the people of Syria. Whether we're talking about the war between Turkey and the Kurds, the war between Saudi Arabia and Iran, the war between the U.S. and Russia, which is in transition right now, all of these wars are being waged in Syria. And the effect in Syria is that it's Syrians doing the dying. It's not Syrians who stand to gain from any of these wars. The only thing we need to do with these wars is not to win them, but to end it, to end the fighting in Syria. This escalation by the United States of its existing level of bombing and special forces engagement and intervention in Syria has now been escalated to direct bombing against the regime's targets. This is going to make things worse and not better. The call, I think, needs to be to stop the bombing, stop the claim that somehow there is a military solution here, acknowledge there is no military solution, and figure out how to make the kind of massive investment of high-profile time, of money, of attention, of all the things into diplomacy, negotiations, a new approach that's not going to be based on the clearly false assumption that somehow this is a war that can be won. It cannot be won. It has to be ended instead.
Let me end on refugees, Alia. The President Trump, not only as president, but on the campaign, repeatedly said he will keep Syrian refugees out of this country, every last one. What now? What is happening now? We just heard about a Syrian activist scholar with a French passport just denied coming into the country in Washington. Even though the courts have said you can't institute this Muslim ban, it's not as if there's not a crackdown now all over the world around Muslims coming in, and particularly Syrians.
I don't like to predict the future, but I don't see a massive change. I think American attention spans are short. I don't think this was a real escalation. It doesn't appear to me that Trump, like everyone has said, Trump clearly doesn't care about the Syrian people. I'm not really sure he's willing to confront Russia in Syria in a massive escalation. I think this is sort of, and I think even to call it an emotional response is quite generous. You know, the Russians had cleared their people from the base. The Syrians had cleared their people from the base. It was very The
U.S. warned the Russians.
So there was it was a highly orchestrated piece of theater. That's what it looks like from now, for me. So I think that tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, something else he's going to be tweeting about or something else is going to happen. Attention spans are going to move. And of course, he's not going to change his policy towards Syrians. I don't believe, look at what he has done as opposed to what he said last night. Do I believe that he is really committed to Syrians living in dignity and peace? I don't think so. And it doesn't serve rhetorically, it doesn't serve him.
And Medea Benjamin, Rex Tillerson will be meeting with the Foreign Minister Lavrov of Russia on Tuesday. Lavrov made a statement condemning the attack, but also left the door open for conversation. Where do you think this goes?
Well, where we wanted to go is to talk to the Russians not about how to divvy up airspace to continue killing Syrians, but to how to end this. And let's put it in the context of President Trump upping the ante by calling for $54 billion more in the U.S. budget for the military. The only ones benefiting from this is Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, the military-industrial complex. Trump wants to widen wars in Syria. He also wants to widen wars in Iraq, in Yemen, and I think we have to stop him before he takes us down a path of greater and greater militarization throughout the Middle East.
I want to thank you all for being with us in Lebanon. Thank you to Yazan al-Saadi, Syrian-Canadian writer in Beirut, Ali Malik here in New York, author of The Home That Was Our Country, a memoir of Syria, Phyllis Bennis, fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies, and Medea Benjamin, co-founder of Code Pink. Thanks so much for being with us, and thanks to Lina Sergi Attar, who joined us earlier from Boston, a writer from Aleppo, co-founder of the Karam Foundation. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, the nuclear option. No, we're not talking about Syria. We're talking about choosing a Supreme Court justice. Stay with us.
The curtain came down. It's time for the end of the show. You had a starring role, so beautiful yet so short. Could have been bright. We saw such promise in your eyes. It's so hard to face this endless silence. As a new day dawns, your smile lingers on the horizon.
Last Curtain Call by Tristam here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we turn to Capitol Hill, where senators voted along party lines Thursday for a historic rule change that will allow Supreme Court justices to be confirmed by a simple majority. The 52-48 vote ended a Democratic-led filibuster aimed at blocking Neil Gorsuch's confirmation, clearing the way for a Senate vote today on President Trump's pick for the Supreme Court. Republican Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said the move was necessary to break a stalemate.
Judge Gorsuch is independent, and he's fair. He's beyond qualified, and he'll make a stellar addition to the Supreme Court. Hardly anyone in the legal community seems to argue otherwise. And yet, our Democratic colleagues appear poised to block this incredible nominee with the first successful partisan filibuster in American history. It would be a radical move, something completely unprecedented in the history of our Senate.
McConnell's comments came more than a year after he led his Senate colleagues on a campaign to refuse to even consider President Obama's pick for the Supreme Court, Merrick Garland. Democrats quickly condemned the move by Republicans to end the filibuster in Supreme Court confirmations, the so-called nuclear option. This is Senate Minority Leader, Democrat Chuck Schumer of New York.
Nuclear option means the end of a long history of consensus on Supreme Court nominations. It weakens the standing of the Senate as a whole, as a check on the president's ability to shape the judiciary. In a post-nuclear world, if the Senate and the presidency are in the hands of the same party, there's no incentive to even speak to the Senate minority. That's a recipe for more conflict and bad blood between the parties, not less.
Neil Gorsuch is expected to be confirmed as a Supreme Court justice in a final Senate vote today, replacing Justice Antonin Scalia nearly 14 months after Scalia's death. For more, we go to Washington, D.C., where we're joined by Ian Millhiser, senior fellow at the Center for American Progress Action Fund, editor of Think Progress Justice, and the author of the book Injustices, the Supreme Court's History of Comforting the Comfortable and Afflicting the Afflicted. Well, to say the least, Ian, there's not a lot of attention outside of Washington right now being paid to what's happening in Washington. Some concerned about a nuclear option or a war in Syria that could lead to that, but not the nuclear option in Washington, D.C. At least it's not getting that kind of attention. Explain what's just happened.
Yeah, I mean, so what happened is that the Senate rules were changed to allow this very, very conservative judge to get through on a simple majority vote. And it's very sad. I mean, I'm not necessarily going to cry over the demise of the filibuster, but it's very, very sad that this man is going to be on the court. Neil Gorsuch is someone who's likely to be very hostile to voting rights, very hostile to women's rights, very hostile to LGBT rights on the court. To give you just one example of the sort of decisions he's handed down, in the middle of his hearing, he had, as a lower court judge, written a decision that severely hobbled a law protecting disabled children. And the Supreme Court unanimously overruled him in the middle of his hearing. So this is a guy who's going to be very, very far to the right. I think that he takes, frankly, a very cruel approach to the law in many cases. And now he's going to be the key fifth vote on a lot of issues.
Now, Ian Millhiser, talk about the significance of the 60 versus 50 vote, how unusual this is.
Yeah. Well, I think what's unusual here is that typically presidents don't appoint someone who is this far either to the right or to the left. I mean, typically presidents have picked someone who are likely to form most of a consensus. I mean, Sonia Sotomayor and Elena Kagan, both of President Obama's nominees, are liberals. But they're not, they're not extremists. And I mean, even John Roberts isn't someone that I would like to see on the Supreme Court. But Chief Justice Roberts, President Bush's first nominee, has shown some ability to moderate himself. I don't think we're going to see that out of Gorsuch. I think that when you look at his record, he could potentially be as far to the right as Justice Thomas, who said that federal child labor laws are unconstitutional. So I think what has happened here is that this president decided to push the envelope as far as he could. There's people he could have named who would have gotten 60 votes. He just decided he would rather have this much more conservative guy. And now here we are with the rules changed because of it.
So when will he be seated? On what decisions, if he is voted in today, will he be a part of? For example, the Muslim ban.
Right. I mean, the Muslim ban could potentially be the first major action he takes as a Supreme Court justice. I mean, that case, I believe, is pending before the Ninth Circuit, which is one step below the Supreme Court. Assuming that the Ninth Circuit upholds, or rather leaves the decision in place halting the ban, then the Trump administration is likely to go straight to the Supreme Court seeking an emergency stay. And I think Gorsuch, based on his record at least, is likely to be a vote to grant that stay. We've got a ton of big cases coming up. We've got several major voter suppression cases, including potentially North Carolina's omnibus voter suppression law. We've got a big challenge to partisan gerrymandering, where he's likely to be a vote in favor of gerrymandering. We just had a case out of the Seventh Circuit saying that it is illegal to fire someone because they are gay. Gorsuch is likely to be a vote saying, "Oh no, it's perfectly legal to fire someone for that reason."
Ian, I want to thank you for being with us, ask you to stay so we can do a short post-show interview. We'll put it at DemocracyNow.org. Ian Millhiser, Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress Action Fund, editor of Think Progress Justice. That does it for our show. Happy birthday to Matt Ely. I'll be speaking tonight in Denver at Sioux Teatro Performing Arts Center. Then Saturday, I'll be speaking in Castlegar, British Columbia in Canada. You can check our website for details. That's at Selkirk College in British Columbia at democracynow.org. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Laura Gottesdiener, Sam Alcoff, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Hani Massoud, Trina Nadura, Andre Lewis, Mike DeFilippo, Miguel Noguera, Paul Huckabee, engineers. Special thanks to Becca Staley, Julie Crosby, Hugh Grand, David Prude, Ariel Boone, Vesta Godars. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.